Hello, dear classmates. Hello, dear professor. I hope you are all doing well. I hope you are all safe and healthy, as well as your whole families. As you all know, today's our presentation is about coding quantitative data. It is a presentation which is going to be delivered by Bukhat Muidat, Zarqan Mohammed, and Bekkouri Mohammed. Given the current circumstances of the novel coronavirus, as you all know, we are still trying to find solutions which fit everybody in class. So our presentation is divided into 5 different parts, and each one of us will tackle a particular part. But don't worry indeed, because all the 5 parts will be collected in one final PowerPoint. In the first part of our oral presentation, we are going to talk about indeed quantification of data, in which I will talk about the rise of quantification, developing code categories, in which I will tackle how to move from codes to categories, recoding and recategorizing. I will also talk about codebook construction, and then I will end up the first part of our presentation by talking about data entry. In quantitative research, researchers are confronted with the process of converting the data they have already collected into numerical forms for statistical analyses. Nowadays, most quantitative analyses are handled by computer programs, particularly the data which are inheritedly numerical, such as age, for instance, income, stages, sex, group affiliation, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. Let me just put you in the center stage of what we are going to talk about in this presentation. As you all know, research design begins with the identification of relevant concepts. How can I put it? The formulation of hypotheses in response to the research question, and so on and so forth. So after the theoretical part, which is of course mainly about literature review, we move on to the practical part, which is the most interesting part of our research project. Here you think of a research sample or sampling which involves identifying and selecting the material you intend to analyze. So in this session, which is of course about coding, we are going to see the transfer of data from questionnaires or whatever into numbers. So variables indeed tend to vary by number or amount, and sometimes even by type or category. And one of the issues of coding is how one, of course, goes from those lists of types, goes from those categories of things into numbers. Don't worry, it is pretty simple. We can do indeed surveys, or we can do a lot of data collections that produce numbers. We can do surveys, we can do experiments, but I do believe that surveys are the most dominant forms of quantitative research. Here we can, or we are going to focus on mainly on coding quantitative research, meaning how to apply those codes for analysis in quantitative research. Because all survey responses indeed need to be coded, but the coding of closed and open questions is a different process. So in the case of open questions, the coding process is simple, as it, how can I put it, as it involves assigning a numerical value to each response. For example, you give 1 to yes or 2 to no, but notice please here that the number is arbitrary. You can assign, for instance, 2 to yes and 1 to no, for instance, because the range of available questions is already known. You see the point? So this makes data entry and data analysis much more effective. So the coding of open questions, however, is much more complex. The coding of open questions is much more complicated, as it leads us to draw a list of categories, also known as coding frames. Yes, coding frames into the, of course, the answers that can be allocated to. That's why this process is time-consuming and requires special attention indeed on the part of researchers. This leads us indeed to ask the following questions. what is the process of coding? How can we code quantitative data? How can we develop code categories? How can we construct a code book? And how can we enter the data to the computer? We will together indeed answer these questions in this part, which is an introduction, which is an introductory part, of course, of our whole session. So before going into details, let's have a clear understanding of quantification of data. Quantification of data is the process of converting data to numerical formats. Before we can do any sort of analysis, we need first to quantify our data. It is indeed the act of giving a numerical value to a measurement of something. In relation to social sciences, quantitative research methods attempt to collect and analyze numerical data on social phenomena. We can say that quantification is really an important is really important in describing and analyzing social phenomena on a larger scale. Why? Simply because it organizes information effectively and makes the data more manageable. What is important here, or what is important about quantification, is the fact that it saves our time. So in this view, many scholars tend to believe that every aspect of the social world can be, or let's say, should be quantified. Here, for instance, Gust 1996, I guess, has argued to a large extent that anything that exists, of course, exists in a certain quantity and can be measured. So quantitative research is important because it generates data which can provide an in-depth, indeed, insight into a question, or let's say maybe an in-depth insight into a topic. Yet, indeed, in order to draw conclusions from quantitative data, it is essential, it is important to quantify the data. So without going into details, I will briefly say that quantification, broadly speaking, is the use of numbers to comprehend, is the use of numbers to understand, is the use of numbers to grasp, of course, objects and events. Let us start first by talking about the rise of quantification. Let me just give you a brief understanding of the historical development of quantification. So over the past few centuries, quantification has become widely used in social sciences. In the beginning of the 20th century, the idea of subjecting social topics to a systematic quantitative analysis has been dominant in Europe. By the first half of the 20th century, the quantitative paradigm has become extremely dominant in most social sciences, including economics, psychology, sociology, and political sciences. In fact, practices of quantification have been widely used, particularly in Europe, since the 13th century. In the first part of the 13th century, the idea that social topics should be subjected to a systematic quantitative analysis has begun to acquire, of course, real dominance in Europe. But by the end, or by the first half of the 20th century, the quantitative approach has been has been widely used in different fields. Hence, the idea of subjecting different fields of study to a systematic quantitative approach started to acquire real and let's say real dominance in Europe, and hence the whole world indeed. This didn't indeed happen haphazardly indeed, but there are so many explanations for that. Why it took great importance in Europe in a relative short time? This is the question that we should ask. This has to do a lot with, of course, the growing process of the great development, of course, of natural sciences. It has also to do with the growing process, or let's say the rise of capitalism and the rational spirit in different Western societies. Now we move on to developing code categories, which is really an important and essential part of this section indeed. So I will start first by defining coding as well as code categories. Then I will of course discuss how to code data with different kinds of questions. So coding is the process of classifying or categorizing individual pieces of data. It is the transformation of raw data into standardized forms suitable for machine processing and analysis. Code categories is a method that enables the researcher to organize and group similarly coded data into categories or families because they share some common characteristics. There are many possible schemes for coding a set of data. Your choice of a particular category should reflect your research purpose. As in the response categories in a closed-ended questionnaire item, code categories should be both exhaustive and mutually exclusive. However, whenever a given response appears to fit equally into more than one one code category, or whenever it fits to no category, problems might or may arise. That's why, indeed, it should be noted that code categories can be modified as you proceed in your coding process. Let me please tell you something which is very important here. You have first of all to identify your variables. Think of what they are, because and think of what they are indeed, because each variable records one particular fact about the respondent. You see what I mean here? Because this is something which is very important, by the way. So you have indeed to talk about the different kinds of data or the different kinds of variables you have within your questionnaire, within your survey, within your experiments, and so on and so forth. So indeed we have what we call nominal data, we have ranked data, we have scales or measures data, we have mixed questions or mixed types data, and we have text answers, and here we talk about open-ended questions. The first, indeed, three types of statistical tests, indeed, are important, or the first three, of course, questions, the first three types of variables are very important for statistical tests. The last two, however, are very much important for coding data, for coding indeed, and let's say data entry. Here, how can I put it? We have texts and we have different types of answers. You see what I mean here? But you intend to do, of course, statistics on them. What I would like to say here, with open-ended questions, we have different types of answers that you intend to apply statistics to them. In fact, we can't do that because at the end of the day, it is a text. But don't worry, indeed, because we will see later on how we can indeed convert those texts into numbers. First, let's start with what you call nominal, indeed, nominal data. We assign, of course, them numbers. The numbers, of course, we assign to them are generally arbitrary, and I will explain why. Here we talk about, for instance, sex, we talk about personality type, we talk about city of birth, we talk about country of birth, and so on and so forth. For example, in sex, we may assign, or we can assign the number 1 to females and number 2 to males, or vice versa. That's why I told you that the number we assign to them is really arbitrary. Concerning the city of birth or the country of birth, we can also use number 1, for instance, for or concerning cities, we can use, for instance, number 1 for Fez, number 2 for Mekons, number 4 or 3 for Tangiers, and so on and so forth. And the same goes with, of course, country of birth. And we use, for instance, number 4 for, let's say, Rabat, and number 5 for other cities. You see what I mean? The yes or no questions, of course, are also important here. And the same, of course, we can assign number 1, for instance, to a yes, or number 2 for no, or vice versa. It doesn't matter. That's why I told you a few minutes ago that those numbers are arbitrary. What is important here is to keep the order those items appear in the survey, indeed. So now we move on to we move on indeed toward what we call ranked or ordinal variables. For instance, here we talk about stages, we talk about social class, and so on and so forth. Let's talk about, for instance, or let's talk about working class, for instance. We can or social class in general. So for example, we number working class with 1, we number middle class with 2, the upper class with 3, and so on and so forth. This is how the process goes indeed. One important thing to add concerning those ranked questions: sometimes you may have a question like the following, for instance. How far do you agree with these statements? And you find the answers like that: strongly agree, agree, neutral, strongly disagree, and disagree. Here as well, you can simply use or assign them arbitrary numbers. The third kind of, for instance, 1 for strongly agree, 2 for agree, 3 for neutral, 4 for strongly disagree, and 5, for instance, for disagree. So the third kind of variables indeed is measures or scales variables, and here we where is where indeed you already have numbers indeed. You already have numbers. For example, age, family size, income, and here we have already numbers, and this might look confusing for you. Here, simply speaking, you assign to those, of course, variables numbers as usual. You just put the numbers. So the only difficult thing you might face at the point of coding is when you want to convert those measures or scales into categories, and we will explain that in details. Don't worry. So this leads us, of course, to the fourth type of the questions, which is called a mixed type data. For instance, age groups. It is very much important here to use numbers. You see what I mean here? To use also numbers as well, just like value labels indeed. For instance, you number or you have, for instance, under 18, you assign the number 1 to under 18, the number 2 to between 18 and 25, number 3 to 25 or greater, and the process goes like this. Sometimes indeed one question may produce several variables. This looks quite indeed difficult. For instance, in a question of what is your favorite sport, tick as many as apply, and you give them the choice, for instance, of football, basketball, handball, for instance, cricket, and swimming. You give them, for instance, 5 choices. In this case, we have to convert the simple question into more than one variable. How we tend to do that depends on the what we want from the results, of course. So the first option is, or the first option we can do is to code each possible sport as a separate variable, and for each of those variables, we can simply give it a value. For instance, yes or no, by using, for instance, 1 for yes and 2 for no, or maybe 2 for yes and 1 for no. Another option is to say a maximum of 3 sports mentioned, and you use numbers for each sport. For example, you give 1 to football, 2 to basketball, and so on and so forth. Now we move on, or now we move into something which is more difficult, something which is more complicated, which is indeed the open-ended questions. For instance, in a research project entitled the use of, or the impact of social media on, or social media networking on the academic achievements of university students, we may have a question like the following. For instance, what is the impact of social media networking on the academic achievements or on the academic performance of university students? Here, one easy option is to do enter indeed the response as a text. But notice please here, you can't do any kind of statistics with it. You can't apply statistics to this kind of answers, so problems arise. problems appear. So how can we solve these problems? Given this regard, indeed, the perfect thing to do is to categorize those responses. And to do this, you have indeed to look for the common or some common answers via which the respondents, of course, express almost the same ideas. You see what I mean here? So this requires from you a deeper interpretation of the data. Meaning what? Meaning in what ways those answers can be categorized. This is quite similar indeed to content analysis, because it is indeed in content analysis that we of course use this kind of analysis. But don't worry, we are going to see in details, or we are going to see details about how to put such answers, how to put such responses into categories. What I would like to strongly note here is try to avoid producing a lot of categories. Maybe 3, 4, 5, or maybe to 6 categories are enough. So without going into details, I brought you indeed an interesting example. So from codes to categories. In Harry Stokes and Klinger's 2005 ethnographic study of the overrepresentation of minorities in special education programs, for instance, data initiated coded as classroom materials, computers, and textbooks were categorized under the major headline of resources. As their study continued, another major category labeled teacher skills, with the subcategories instructional skills and management skills. And this is how it looks like. We have the major category, which is of course teacher skills, which is divided into 2 major subcategories, including instructional skills and management skills. Instructional skills is divided into 4 different codes, including pedagogical skills, emotional skills, style skills, technical skills. And the second subcategory, which is of course management skills, is divided into 4 different codes, including behaviorist techniques, group management, socio-emotional, and unwritten skills. So now we move on to talk about recoding and recategorizing. Rarely will anyone get coding right at the very first time. As you code and recode, strive for your codes and categories to become more refined. As you progress towards second cycle coding, there may be some rearrangement of the classification of coded data into different and even new categories. As Abbott in the 2004 noted, it is the process of pre-coding and recategorizing is like the process of decorating a room. You try it, step back, move few things, step back again, try serious reorganization, and so on and so forth. Let's take another example, or let's take a real example, of course, related to a research project, just to make things much easier for you to understand and to remember. We collect data, for instance, on the way primary school students hurt and oppress each other. Their responses have been initially categorized into physical and verbal forms of oppression. In terms of the category of physical oppression, we can specify simply this category into 3 different codes, namely pushing, scratching, and fighting. The category of verbal oppression can be specified or can fall under the codes of name calling, threatening, and sarcasm. As coding continues, some oppressions were a combination of both indeed physical and verbal actions. For example, a child can exclude another child from a game physically, accompanied with the verbal statements such as, for instance, you can't play with us. Therefore, a third major category emerges called physical and verbal oppression. As the study of course continues, more data can be collected using different methods. For instance, gender differences in children's perceptions and enactments of oppression appears. For participants, of course, oppression is not about the body and voice, it is rather about force and feelings. So the 3 initial categories we already talked about are directly reduced into only two categories, which resonates, of course, those gender differences we have just mentioned. So with the emergence of those new categories, some subcodes also tend to appear. In the category of oppression, for instance, through physical force, we can talk about the code of fighting, in which we can also talk about the subcodes of scratching, pushing, and so on and so forth. Also, in the category of oppression through hurting others' feelings, for instance, we can talk about the code of putting down, via which we can talk also about name calling, teasing, and so on and so forth. What I would like to elaborate here, indeed, is that we cannot also, we cannot, of course, only talk about the movement from codes and two categories, but we can also talk about the movement, of course, from codes and categories to theory. And here it is very much related to quantitative research. Because generally this kind of movements from codes and categories to theory, as I have just said, has to do a lot with qualitative research. So let me just give you some hints about these movements from codes and categories to theory. Richards and Morse 2007 have also demonstrated that categorizing is how we get up from diversity of data to the shapes of the data. Also, themes and concepts is how we get up to more general and higher, to a more general and higher level. So our ability to show how these themes and concepts interrelate with each other in a systematic way is what leads indeed to the development of a theory. So the question that the majority of you might ask here is the following: what is the difference between codes and themes? I will say simply that theory is nothing but an outcome of coding, categorizing, and or coding and categorization, simply speaking. But this has to do a lot indeed with qualitative research. Now we move on to talk about codebook construction. So because the number of codes can accumulate quite quickly and change as analysis progresses, your codes can separately be kept in a file called a codebook. So what is a codebook? A codebook is, or according to Bobby 2016, a codebook is a document that describes the locations of variables and lists the assignments of codes to the attributes composing those variables. So it is a compilation of the codes, their content description, and a brief data example for reference. It describes the contents, structure, and layout of a data collection. McQueen et al. 2008 largely recommended that each codebook entry should contain the code, a brief definition, guidelines for when to use the code, guidelines for not to use the code, and examples. Let me explain to you things more. The data created for the research project will be maintained indeed, so that you can, how can I put it, so that you can have the chance, or so that you can review them whenever you want. And this is the perfect place to do this process. A good book is the perfect place, the perfect place to do this of course process. This gives you indeed the chance or the opportunity to organize and reorganize your codes into categories, and why not subcategories. Here I would like to mention something which is really important indeed. As you all know, we are all working on a research project, not individually, but we rather have a teamwork, meaning a joint research project. So how can we code in a collaborative way? But I tell you here that everything has a solution. In fact, multiple authors have suggested different ways of analyzing and interpreting the data of a joint research project. Given this regard, Western et al. 2001 argued that a research team builds codes and coding builds a team through the creation of a shared interpretation and a shared bad understanding of the phenomenon, of course, being studied. So team members should actually coordinate with each other. So those intercoders, those in charge of coding the data, should remain consistent with their assignments of particular codes to particular data so that they can effectively proceed at this level. The last part of, or the last section of my part is going to be, or is about data entry. Once the data has been coded, it is ready for entering the data, or it is ready for entering the data into the computer. These include transfer sheets, edge coding, direct data entry, direct entry by interviewers, coding to optical scan sheets, direct use of optical scan sheets. Data entry is often thought of as a time-consuming process, but there are indeed steps you can take to make the process more efficient. Assign an ID number for each form or survey to be entered and write the number at the top of each survey. Schedule a large enough block of time to enter an entire batch of data at once. Before you begin entering the data, take time to go through each completed survey and identify questionable responses. So, briefly speaking, after coding the data, it is time for the researcher to enter the data to, of course, the computer in what we call data entry. It can be either scanned or entered by hand. In fact, scanning is much more expensive, but it is quicker, by the way. It is quicker than manual data entry. It is also effective as it leaves indeed no chance for, how can I put it? It leaves no chance indeed for human error, that is to say. Manual data entry, however, is much more cheaper but more time consuming, and it can lead to, of course, some possible errors. It should be noted at this level, please, that you should clean your data by correcting any possible error, of course, or any possible errors in the data set before carrying out, of course, any work on it. One final remark concerning data entry: scanning is indeed better at this stage because it reduces, of course, the possibility of error making, as it rejects indeed all different kinds, all different types of invalid responses. So to this point, I would like just to tell you that I have just finished the first part of our presentation, which was mainly about quantification of data, in which I talked about codes as well as categories. I have also talked about several notions here, and I try to do my best to explain things more. So now I leave you with the second part of our presentation concerning coding quantitative data with my colleague Bukhat Muidad. The third part will be delivered by my colleague Zarqan Mohammed, and I will meet you back in the fourth part of our presentation. See you back.